Imagine Paris, 1793. The air is thick with tension, the streets thrumming with the sounds of revolution. Amidst this storm stands one figure, a woman whose name has become a symbol, Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France. To many, she was the embodiment of a failed monarchy, a distant figure of lavish excess. But the story of her final days is far more complex and human than the simple angry headlines suggest. Let's rewind. Not long before, Marie Antoinette lived in the dazzling world of Versailles. Picture glittering ballrooms, opulent banquets, and gardens so perfect they seemed unreal. This was a life of music, fashion, and privilege. But beyond the golden gates of the palace, a different France was struggling. People were hungry, taxes were high, and a deep sense of injustice was brewing. The court seemed a world away, a fantasy disconnected from reality. Marie, young and raised in this bubble of royalty, was ill-prepared for the storm that was gathering. She wasn't the heartless villain her enemies painted her to be, but a person sheltered from the harsh realities her people faced. As the whispers of discontent grew into shouts of revolution, the royal family's world began to crumble. The first major blow came when they were forced to leave the splendor of Versailles for the Tuileries Palace in Paris. Their gilded cage was replaced by a more literal one. The laughter and music of the court were drowned out by the constant roar of the city streets. They were no longer rulers, they were prisoners in their own capital. For Marie, this was a shocking transformation. Every move she made was scrutinized, every word she spoke twisted and used against her. She went from being an admired, if distant, queen to the focal point of all the public's rage. Madame Deficit, they called her, blaming her for the nation's financial woes. The public's perception of her had soured completely, fueled by pamphlets and caricatures that depicted her as a monster. Then came the fall of the monarchy. The family attempted a desperate escape, but they were captured and brought back to Paris in disgrace. This sealed their fate. The hope of a constitutional monarchy vanished, and the reign of terror began. King Louis XVI was put on trial and executed. Marie Antoinette, now a widow, was left to face the revolution alone. Her situation became even more dire when she was transferred to the conciergerie, a grim fortress prison, often called the antechamber to the guillotine. The contrast with Versailles could not have been more extreme. Stripped of all her finery, her silks replaced with a simple dark dress, she lived in a small, damp cell under the constant watch of guards. The greatest cruelty, however, was the separation from her children. Her son Louis Charles was taken from her, a heartbreak from which she never recovered. Alone, isolated, and grieving, she spent her days in quiet solitude, a ghost of the vibrant queen she once was. All the privileges of royalty were gone, leaving only a mother mourning her husband and her children. Finally, her own trial began. It was less a legal proceeding and more a piece of political theatre. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere charged with hatred. The accusations thrown at her were a mix of political charges and vile, personal slander. For most of the trial, she remained composed, answering questions with a quiet dignity that surprised many. But then, her accusers stooped to a new low. They brought forward a horrifying and baseless charge, coerced from her own young son, that was so monstrous it stunned the courtroom into silence. It was a moment designed to break her completely, but it didn't. Rising to her feet, her voice clear and steady, she turned not to the judges, but to the women in the crowd. "If I have not answered," she said, "it is because nature itself refuses to reply to such a charge made against a mother." In that instant, she wasn't a queen or a political symbol. She was a mother, appealing to the shared humanity in the room. For a brief moment, the tide of opinion seemed to shift. A ripple of sympathy went through the crowd. But it was only a moment. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, decided not by evidence, but by the revolutionary fervor sweeping the nation. She was found guilty of treason. On the morning of October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was led from her cell for the last time. Her hair had been cut short, her hands bound behind her back. She was placed in an open Carter tumbrel to be paraded through the streets of Paris on her way to the guillotine. This was the ultimate humiliation, a stark contrast to the gilded carriage she had arrived in years before. The crowds that lined the route jeered and insulted her. But witnesses, even those who despised her, noted her unwavering composure. She sat upright, her gaze steady, refusing to be broken by the fury surrounding her. She showed no fear, only a kind of weary resignation. As she climbed the steps of the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. "Pardon me, sir," she said. "I did not do it on purpose." These were her final words, an apology, a small, final act of courtesy in a world that had shown her none. 4 years after her death, her memory was buried under layers of propaganda and rumor. She remained the villain of the story. It was only much later, as the passions of the revolution cooled, that a more nuanced understanding of her life began to emerge. Eventually, her remains were exhumed and laid to rest beside her husband in the Basilica of Saint Denis, a quiet act of remembrance after a lifetime of public spectacle. The story of Marie Antoinette is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It's a profoundly human tragedy. It's the story of a woman caught in the crossfire of history, a symbol burdened with the sins of an entire system. Her life is a powerful reminder of how easily the truth can be distorted by anger, and how quickly compassion can be lost in the turbulent currents of change. And through it all, she maintained a quiet strength, a dignity in the face of unimaginable pressure that history has, at long last, begun to recognize. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more journeys into the past. Let me know in the comments what you think about Marie Antoinette's story. See you next time.